The longer I have a garden, the more difficult the transition into fall becomes. It's not so much the cooler weather that bothers me, but the shorter days. Feeling the days get shorter makes me anticipate the loss of the summer garden. I've spent most of the year preparing and executing in the garden, and in just a handful of weeks it will all be gone. I feel like every year is a jog that turns into a sprint and then a sudden stop. I love living somewhere I can experience all the seasons, but I still feel a loss when that first frost comes. And knowing it's not too far off always makes me sad. Don't get me wrong, I'm excited for the slower seasons ahead as it gives me more time to work on different hobbies such as crochet. And speaking of crochet, I am very far behind on the temperature blanket this year because of how abundant this summer has been. I'd also really like to relearn sewing over the fall and winter and maybe try my hand at some knitting. For now though, I'm trying to soak up every minute I can in this garden. I can feel it pulling away and I just want to enjoy all I can before it's too late.
Good morning, everyone. So I broke out my camp stove because I'm going to do some pressure canning today. I honestly don't know if I've done any pressure canning for the year so far, but I want to do some beans today, which I have actually never done. Beans are a new one for me. It was on my list last year and then I just never did it. So I'm doing like a little test batch today and I'll probably do some bulk beans here in the upcoming weeks because I want to have a bunch on my shelf for chilies and soups and things like that. I also want to start getting broth done as well. I have zero chicken broth on my shelf at this point and I don't like to do that, especially going into the fall and winter season, because I ran into the problem where I ran out and then we got sick, and I don't want that to happen again because I love having homemade chicken broth. But this morning I'm about to head inside. I'm gonna go ahead and get the beans started. I have them soaked already for like the last, I want to say like 15 hours or so. So they are ready to go. We do need to get them up to a boil and get them hot. But overall, this seems like a very, very easy process. I will link the website down below. I believe this is the National Food Preservation website through Georgia, if I'm not mistaken. But I will link that down below. It gives you all the safety guidelines, and this is something you do have to pressure can. So we are going to do some pressure canning today. You have to process beans just like you do meat. I have done chicken before, and I believe it's 75 minutes for pints. I'd need to double check that, but that's not the whole processing time. That's the one thing that's really deceiving with pressure canning, is you will see a processing time, but you also have the time frame of getting that pressure canner up to pressure and then down to pressure, which typically, in my experience, adds like an extra 30 minutes. So we are going to be doing beans pretty much all morning. So that is why I'm getting started early. So I do all of my pressure canning out here on this camp stove. I know every pressure canner is different. I have an all-American. I don't think the Prestos you can do this with, but don't count me on that. Check your manual. But one thing is, my pressure canner, even if I wanted to try, it does not fit underneath my microwave with my stove. I can't even have it on there with the lid. It is just really big. So it's one of those things even if I wanted to with my glass top, I couldn't do it. So I've had this thing now, I want to say, for 4 years, and it has been great for pressure canning. And now that we are starting to cool off a little bit, I'm not too mad about being outside doing canning things.
So as you can see here, even if I try to press this, I guess it kind of fits, but not really. So this is just one of those things that it is big. So I have a pot of beans here that I've been soaking overnight, and I'm gonna get these all rinsed off and rinsed, and then I'm going to put the beans back in the pot, fill it with water, and we are going to get these up to a boil and cook for 30 minutes before placing into our jars. I do already have my jars in the dishwasher ready to go, all clean, and this should be a pretty simple process. I will say one of the easiest things I think I've ever pressure canned is chicken breast. And a lot of the time it just takes a long time. It's not like it's hard. I will say I'm definitely a rule follower when it comes to canning. I have too much anxiety to break the rules when it comes to safety. If you look up how to can black beans, especially on TikTok, there is a ton of people
who will just use dry beans and put them in the jar and then top them with water, which yes, that does seem easier, but I will say you're having a lot of dirt that you probably did not clean off doing that, and it's just one of those things where I would rather follow the guidelines with this. I will say another reason why I think it is important to pre-soak is because the consistency of the bean changes at that point, and you want to make sure you are heating the food all the way through while you're doing your canning process. So to me, it makes sense to pre-soak everything. Okay, and I was correct. So this is the National Center of Home Food Preservation from the University of Georgia. I will link these instructions down below for you guys. So for pints, the processing time is 75 minutes, and I will actually do my pressure at 15 pounds of pressure because of my elevation. So it is important to note that, because a lot of people pressure can around 10, and for me, I have to pressure can at 15. For me, I prefer to do most things in pints. I was actually telling my husband, I was like, we have so many quarts downstairs, because when I first started canning, I bought a ton of quarts. But with it just being me and my husband, I have found that pints work a lot better for us. And I prefer pints because that's typically how much a can is. So if you're trying to follow any type of recipe, or if you are just a couple like we are, I find pints just to be that much easier, except for broth. When it comes to broth, I like quarts. Other than that, I have really preferred to just do pints. All right, so I'm gonna get this on the stove, and we are going to get this up to a boil, and we are gonna cook it for 30 minutes. And then once that 30 minutes is up, that is when I will start filling jars. I am also going to get a kettle of water going for this. When I put my hot jars in the pressure canner, I can also top with hot water, because one thing you don't want to do is mix cold and hot, especially with glass. You don't want anything to crack and break. And this will just help me out because I can't get any water hot while this is inside. While the beans are boiling, I'm just gonna make sure that I give it a stir every so often. So as I wait for everything, I'm gonna go ahead and get some water at the bottom of my pressure canner. I do need to heat up some more water, and that is one reason why I went ahead and did that. One of my biggest tips when it comes to doing any type of canning is to put some vinegar in your canner. If you are like me and you have hot water, this is so great, so your jars will stay clear. If you do forget this step, don't worry, you can just take some vinegar and water after. It's just kind of a pain to clean. To keep everything nice and toasty, I'm just gonna slide that lid on. All right, it's been 30 minutes, and what I'm going to do here is start filling these jars up with some beans, and I'm gonna fill everything to a 1-inch head space. That's pretty much what you do for all pressure canning. Now that all the beans are in, I'm just gonna take this cooking liquid and we're going to fill the jars with it. And do probably like a ladle of each one, and then kind of debubble everything. Wipe the rim, make sure the rims of these jars are clean. The purple all on there. Place a lid. With the All-Americans, you do want to have 2 to 3 inches of water at the base before putting any of your jars, and I'm just going to top with just a little bit more hot water. All right, and I'm just going to adjust any of these jars. Sounds like one of my chickens is going crazy from any shifting. And now I'm gonna get my pressure canner lid on. So this is actually pretty important. You're gonna line up the arrow, which looks like I have this backwards. And I'm just going to adjust it like that. So with an All-American, you wanna make sure that this is on here as even as possible. So it's smart to take the parallel sides and tighten them up at the same time. All right, so to get this thing turned on, I'm just going to open the propane. Make sure my lighter's working. Perfect, okay. And I'm just gonna get this on low. Perfect. All right, now is the waiting game. So we have to wait for this thing to vent. Once it starts to vent, you want it to have a continuous vent for 10 minutes, then you put on the weighted gauge. But then once you put on the weighted gauge, you have to wait for your pressure to come up, and then your processing time starts. One thing I forgot to mention is you can add salt. Salt is an optional thing when it comes to canning beans or really anything related to canning, because it's not necessary for the canning process, but it is one of those things I typically do not add. So it's kind of hard to see. There you go. The stream is definitely going, so I'm gonna put a timer on for 10 minutes. And once the 10 minutes is up, we will put on our weight. Okay, this has been venting for 10 minutes. You can see that the pressure is already building a little bit. So on this weighted gauge, we have a 5, 10, and 15, and I will be doing it at 15 pounds of pressure. So all I'm gonna do is put that on there, and this is what will tell us once we get to 15 pounds of pressure. And once we're at 15 pounds of pressure, this thing will start to rattle, and that is when our timer starts, and we have 75 minutes once that happens. So I did bring everything out at 9:40, so this got turned on at 9:40, so that will kind of tell us a little bit better of the whole processing time. All right, we are at 15 pounds of pressure. It's a lot easier to walk away from water bath canning than it is pressure canning, because you do need to make sure it's constantly staying at pressure for that entire processing time. So I will have to kind of adjust this fire flame just a little bit, but looks like we're staying at 15, and we will see how this goes. I'm gonna lower it just a little bit here. Okay, processing time is done. So all I'm going to do is turn off the heat, and I'm going to leave the weighted gauge on. Now at this point, we wait for the pressure to go back down to 0 before taking off the gauge. All right, everything is now at 0. So I'm just gonna take a cloth here and grab that gauge. You can see there's still some pressure in there. And then once this stops, I'll take it inside. So since I have to move this, I'm keeping it very, very level to make sure nothing clanks. It is getting hot out there, and it is 1 minute till 12. So 2 hours and 20 minutes from start to finish on the processing, when the processing time was 1 hour 15. So what I'm gonna do is undo these. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna get this lid off, and I'm gonna pull it away from me. That way none of the steam comes towards me. And I'm gonna let these dryers sit for 5 minutes so they can kind of get adjusted to temperature here. So now I'm just lifting them out of the canner. I'm gonna set them onto this hot plate to rest and sit for about the next 12 to 24 hours. Typically with pressure canning, I like to do bigger batches than this, but since this was my first time doing beans, wasn't really sure what to expect and like how much I really needed. Overall, very easy process. It just takes a little bit of time, and honestly, I spent less time doing this than a lot of my tomato projects during the year. So take that as a note. So the other thing I really wanted to get done today was actually process some of my garlic into more garlic powder. So I've used a good amount, but I still have a good amount here, and I do want to have more garlic powder on hand. I'm actually almost out of the stuff I did. I'm looking to get some more garlic powder made, and I'm not gonna take like any of my really big heads of garlic because I'll probably end up saving those cloves to replant. I will be actually grabbing some of my Georgian fire though, because I did order some more of this, and these cloves are massive, and I actually don't like to roast these ones as much as I thought I would because they are so big. I prefer to have a garlic that's more on this side if I'm going to do any type of roasting. So I am going to grab a handful of this Georgian fire here, but I'm hoping to get
at least like a few pints or maybe a quart's worth of garlic powder done. I don't really enjoy peeling all the garlic, but it is really, really good. I'm gonna grab majority, all of the smaller heads. I had a really consistent harvest this year where I had really good heads of garlic, and this was honestly the best garlic harvest I have ever had in the 5 years I've grown garlic. I'm pretty sure it's 5 years. But yeah, I'm gonna grab some of these smaller heads here. Most of the time, all of this garlic will be good to go until about November, December. I have all these spaced out. So I have some chestnut red. This is my Ischium red, which is my soft neck variety, and I have that all braided up. I have really enjoyed Italian purple. I still think chestnut red is my absolute favorite variety. The flavor on it is just so unmatched. This Italian purple is very buttery when you roast it, which I also really, really like. The last time I made garlic powder, I did a combination of all three, and I really enjoyed that. So I'm just grabbing some of the smaller heads here. And we'll probably just head back upstairs and we'll be peeling garlic for a while. But I think maybe grab one more. Nah. I think I'm gonna do maybe about like that. Then we'll save the rest. I personally like to roast my garlic in full garlic heads or make garlic comfy all the time. So I want to save a good amount of all these. Okay, I think that's a good amount. Let's go with that. This is what I will be working with today to make garlic powder. And I'm gonna go ahead and break up all of these heads into individual cloves. And then I'm going to go ahead and get everything peeled. So while I was peeling the heads of garlic into individual cloves, I did want to mention, because I thought of this, one of the reasons why I decided to do some of my smaller heads of garlic downstairs, even though I did say most of them are all very similar size. I got really good consistency this year, and it really does correlate to your cloves going into the ground. When you have smaller heads of garlic and smaller cloves, that is going to directly correlate to how big your head of garlic is as well. There are other factors like feeding your garlic and weather conditions and things like that, but it does play a decent role. So I did want to mention that. But one thing is we are approaching garlic planting season. So if you are new to planting garlic, or if you want to plant your own, for me, I've typically been planting it mid to late October here for Kansas Zone 7A. I was 6B there for a while. Our last average frost is right around mid-October. I did recently look this up just to kind of see if they changed it with all of the zone changes, and it's now pushed back. But I really think this year we're going to have an earlier frost. It just feels like we're going to have an earlier frost. I feel like I've said this now in like the last 3 videos, but all of you guys are saying very similar things. You've had a cooler season, even though it's hot outside. You've had a cooler season, a rainier season. So I have a feeling it's going to be earlier. So for where I'm at, we can have a frost as early as the last week of September, which I can honestly say in my 7 years of gardening, I have never experienced that. For me, I think the earliest I've experienced was probably like the 2nd week of October, but the last few years has been late. It's been pretty much the very end of October. So that's typically when I plant out my garlic. I wait for that first frost at minimum, because you still have probably about 4 weeks or so, or even longer, until you have a hard freeze. And you kind of want to time that out to where you're not having too much growth on your garlic before that hard freeze comes, just so it doesn't really stress out the plants during winter. I will say I've had 6 inches of growth, and we've had a cold winter and everything did just fine. So don't stress about that too much.
But we are approaching garlic planting season. So if you haven't thought about it, I highly suggest growing your own garlic. It's one of those things where you get a nice harvest right at the beginning of summer. For me, I typically am harvesting garlic that first to second week of June. And it's honestly one of my favorites. I personally think homegrown garlic is one of those big things you can tell a huge difference in flavor, kind of like tomatoes. There are a few things when you're growing them in your garden that you won't notice too big of a difference, but garlic I think is like one of the biggest. The flavor on homegrown garlic is like nothing I've ever had, especially hardneck garlic. So I grow majority hardneck garlic. I have played around with softneck garlic. That is where you saw the braid downstairs. So softneck will actually store a lot longer than hardneck. Softneck will store anywhere for about 9 to 12 months, when a hardneck garlic will only store for about 6. Some of them can be lesser than that, around 4 to 5. So typically they start to maybe not do as good the moment they need to be planted in the ground, especially if you're harvesting them in June or July. So that is one of those things where I wanted to make that note, that if you're thinking about growing garlic, or if you haven't thought about growing garlic, I highly suggest it. It's honestly my favorite thing to grow. I've had really good luck with it over the years, and this year was my best harvest to date. So I am very, very excited. I actually planted less garlic this year and got significantly more pounds. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I did mention it in my garlic video. But I had right around, I want to say 19 to 20 pounds of garlic at the end, and I planted less. Last year, I think I got right around 12 pounds. So having all the extra this year has really allowed me to do more garlic powder. Garlic powder, especially organic garlic powder, is not the cheapest thing. Obviously, it is a little bit of a labor of love with all the peeling you're doing, but I also think the flavor is so good. So once I get all these cloves peeled, I will be blending them in my blender to kind of break them up and mince them, and then I will be putting them on freeze dryer trays. So I will say I do not like making garlic powder in the oven or with a dehydrator. I think it gives it more of a roasted flavor and completely changes the flavor. If you want a flavor more like a grocery store garlic powder, even though this garlic powder is significantly better, a freeze dryer is honestly one of those things that it's so game changer when making any type of powder from your garden. I also do this with onion powder. Those are my 2 favorite things to make in my freeze dryer. I will just grab a few onions, chop them down, and blend them up and make an onion powder. I did that a few weeks ago with you guys when I was having all of the issues with my onion harvest this year. But yeah, I will be using a freeze dryer, and I can honestly say, if I didn't have the freeze dryer, I don't know if I would put in the effort to make garlic powder. I was actually really disappointed the one year I did do it. It also took forever in the dehydrator. It takes like, when you mince it down for the freeze dryer, it takes like 13 to like 15 hours. The dehydrator took me days. And with it being a higher heat and all that, you just don't get a fresh flavor. And for me, I want the garlic to taste like the garlic is. And that is why I love the freeze dryer. The freeze dryer does not change the flavor whatsoever. It's another one of those things where I love my freeze dryer versus canning too, for that simple purpose of just very easy. So yeah, I'm gonna get all of these peeled. I think I rambled a little bit there, but this will probably take me a little bit of time, and I will catch up with you guys once I get it all peeled. Actually, hold up. Let me show you guys the little trick I have kind of learned over the years to kind of make peeling a little bit easier. All right, so to make peeling a little bit easier, the one thing I like to do is just slightly cut off the base of the garlic here with a knife, just very minimally, and this will start the process of peeling it back. And typically you can get these pretty good in like 1 to 2 sweeps. You watch, this will be the one that gives me a hard time. There's always that one that gives me a hard time, but you can typically peel it pretty quickly, unlike trying to smash it and deal with it. That's what I did in the past. I saw a TikTok video a few years ago that showed someone using like a tweezer, like a garlic tweezer. And I was like, oh, okay, well, let me just try to kind of cut off that base a little bit, and maybe it will do a very similar thing. And it does. You can see how quick and easy that was. So that is my little hack for peeling some garlic. So when it comes to the freeze dryer, one thing I learned late is you should actually be using all of your trays when you put them into the freeze dryer. So I am going to mince this up and just kind of spread it out amongst all 5 trays. By getting it into a really thin layer like this, it will probably go pretty quickly. But we have a good amount of garlic here, so you can see how 2 pounds of garlic will give you a good amount of minced garlic. So one thing I will note, if you don't have a freeze dryer or a dehydrator and you're looking to use fresh garlic, but maybe it's like starting to get soft or you know it's going to be not storing as well, I would mince up a ton of garlic like this and I would take tablespoon measurements and put it all on a cookie sheet and pre-freeze it. So then pre-freezing it, I could just toss all of those, like I put them in the freezer for about 12 hours. And then at that point, it was nice and hard to where I could throw them all into a freezer bag. And then I had tablespoon measurements that I could just grab out. And that worked out really well. I actually had garlic in my freezer for up to a year, which was really nice. It's also really easy to cut like directly from the freezer to where if you don't want a whole tablespoon, it works out really well doing that. And that was one of my favorite ways to preserve garlic until I got a freeze dryer, because freeze dryers are expensive. I mean, they're definitely not as accessible as like a dehydrator is or things like that. The one thing I will note when it comes to like doing that method is I would advise you to double bag them in a freezer bag, because if you don't, you might have a little bit issues with freezer burn over like that length of time. You could also use a food saver and that, just so it would help with that. But I would also double bag it just so then the smell doesn't linger in your freezer. But I'm going to get these all downstairs. I already have my freeze dryer on. I think that will be it for this afternoon. I will catch up with you guys in the morning. Good morning, guys. So the freeze dryer is almost done and I have some jars here that I got to clean and sanitize. One thing when it comes to doing anything dry, I like to make sure my jars are as clean as possible if I plan to store them in jars. So I also need to make sure that they are dry, so we're not having any pockets of freeze dried stuff get re-wet. So I have a rack in here and these jars are already hot because they just got done. So I'm gonna put them in the oven to fully dry off before all of our freeze-dried stuff is done. And that should be done here, I wanna say in about like 20-30 minutes or so. So those should be done. I'm gonna let them cool before I get any of our garlic into them, but I do need to blend up the garlic one more time to make it into a powder. But that is what we're gonna do with that. So with the beans I did yesterday, I'm just going to get these rings off now that they are fully cooled and settled, and check the lids on everything. I did already date them earlier, but it looks like everything is good to go. So I do store all of my jars without rings. This is what's recommended. So that way, if your lid does end up unsealing, this ring doesn't accidentally reseal it, because that wouldn't be a safe product. So it's just a lot easier to know if something were to go bad. At this point, I am just gonna go ahead and carefully take these out and let them cool. Wasn't exactly sure how many jars I would need, if I would need a quart or a pint, so I just made sure I cleaned a few. I'm gonna carefully transfer this into the jar here. Actually fits really well. So to seal up the jar, I'm actually going to use my vacuum sealer. This is new to me and I've been loving this so much, especially for my dry goods. I got this jar attachment for it and I just think it's really, really nice. So I'm just gonna press the canister button. You can see all of that getting pumped out. Very cool. So at this point, the jar is completely sealed as well. So that is really nice. And we got almost a full quart of onion powder out of the almost 2 pounds. I think I was a whole ounce off. I'm just gonna get this dated really quick here. Mark it as garlic because it looks very similar to onion powder, even though I'm sure I could tell by the smell when I open it. But this is our little haul we're gonna add to the pantry today. I still have my pressure canner out because I think I'm going to start some broth once I get done with this. I roasted up some chickens the other day and I need to use those bones to make some broth. And I just got cheesecloth last night. I ran out of cheesecloth to strain the broth and that is what I needed to go ahead and start a batch of that. But I think this is where I'm going to kind of end things for today. I'm really excited to play around with more canning beans and doing all of that. And I'm really excited to have another good amount of garlic powder going in. I will say my garlic powder I made at the end of the, I want to say like maybe like mid-July. I still have about this much. So I'm thinking like about every 3, maybe 3.5 months, I'm going through a pint's worth. So I think I will probably use up the rest of this probably in the next like 2 to 3 weeks into September. So that means that this garlic powder here should get me, I would think, until maybe December or January. And I will probably make another batch of garlic powder as well once things start to not store as well, / I get garlic planted. So this will probably not be it for the garlic powder for the year, but I'm really excited because I think I'm going to at least get a whole year's worth of garlic powder this year on top of having so much to roast and replant, which is really exciting. Again, we had such a good garlic year, but I'm gonna get these things down to the basement and I'm gonna get these bones on the stove and start the whole broth making process. But thank you guys so much for hanging out with me as I did a little bit of experimenting over the last 24 hours and did some garlic powder. I will see you guys all in the next one. Bye.